is the first step in determining your fertility program for either corn, milo, or soybeans for this spring?
Yes, Sandra, we talk a lot about soil sampling and testing today as one of the first steps really in a fertility management program. And it's not something new, but it's something that still the first step and probably the most important step that we have to keep in mind. And a year like this, grain prices are low. We are concerned about cutting expenses. And sometimes we say, well, maybe we don't want to do soil testing. I typically say a year like this is when you actually have to do more soil testing. The economics definitely pays the investment on that soil testing. Having that information to be able to go and make a decision for what kind of rates to apply is even more important in a year like this with tight budgets. So definitely that's still the first step that I think we have to keep in mind for our main crops, especially the immobile nutrient, but also the mobile nutrients, the nitrogen. We are dealing more with sulfur, with chloride in recent years, and all of those can be managed very well with soil tests as a first step in that process.
Okay. My presentation during the meeting was soil testing, so I went through the procedures to soil test, the proper depths in order to take in order to get the accurate samples. So as Dorivar mentioned, there's nitrogen, sulfur, chloride. Those would be your very mobile nutrients. So you want to get a really deeper sample of that, which would be 18 to 24 inches if possible. Your immobile nutrients that we discussed were at least phosphorus. So especially be sure that you get the proper soil depths. And if you need more information on that, we do have the handouts for our meeting as well. Okay, our next question is, even though we are visiting about corn, milo, and soybeans, is there one method of fertilizer application that is more efficient and effective for any of the crops mentioned?
Yes, and we're talking probably mostly in this case about fertilizer placement, and there are some advantages when we're talking about ban application for main crops. But not all the time. In conditions where soil test tends to be close to optimum and we are managing that nutrient near to the optimal level, we have flexibility, and we see the data, the research we have shows that broadcast application can be just as equally efficient as ban application in that situation. However, we're talking about more low testing soils, more deficient situation. That's where we really need to be thinking about banding fertilizer. If we're doing some type of application below the soil, below the residue, those are all things that we need to be thinking about for phosphorus and other nutrients. Now, if we're talking about nitrogen in particular, in no-till system, oftentimes we will see a lot of benefit from banding and especially putting that nitrogen below the residue, because in no-till system, if we have good cover, good residues in the surface, we can have some tie-up, and broadcast could be a concern. We can have some losses in that kind of situation. So definitely, again, we do have a lot of data that shows for nitrogen in no-till system, we should be doing dribble using streamer bars, things like that for liquid, and if all possible, putting it below the residue. And in phosphorus situation, if we have low testing phosphorus, we should be banding that fertilizer. And we start to thinking about things like starter fertilizers and 2x2 placement and so on. So those things are all options to increase efficiency.
Okay, so there's lots of different methods depending on what your tillage operations are, what your crop is. He talked about banding, he talked about dribbling, he talked about broadcasting. So if you would like a copy of the research that K-State has done showing the efficiencies of these different methods, I'll be glad to get that to you as well. Okay, so let's start with corn. Is a starter fertilizer important? I know that you mentioned that in our meeting as well.
Yes, we talk a lot about starter fertilizers, and corn typically is the crop that tends to benefit the most from starter fertilizer because we plant it early, and again, just that benefit in early growth and so on, availability of that nutrient can make a big difference. Now, what situations can benefit the most from that starter fertilizer? And again, we kind of mentioned that already. If we are talking about phosphorus, if it is a really low testing phosphorus, I would definitely encourage a starter fertilizer using corn. No-till system tends to benefit also more from starter fertilizers, and a lot of that is because a little bit cooler soil temperatures and so on, that corn tends to be just a little bit slower to start in the spring. So that starter fertilizer is very helpful in that situation. So we talk a lot about phosphorus, but nitrogen is equally important also as a starter fertilizer. And that's something that we need to keep in mind because Having that nitrogen available to the roots early in the season can make a big difference. Again, not just the phosphorus, but also the nitrogen for corn. Again, situations where maybe we are doing most of the nitrogen apply as a citrus, or if we are using anhydrous, for example, and we have an anhydrous band, the roots are not going to get to that nitrogen early on. So that starter fertilizer with some nitrogen with it can make a big difference until the root system get to a better situation and better growth.
Okay. So remember, if you have corn in mind for this season, to think about the starter, especially, but a starter with phosphorus, but with nitrogen as well. That will help that utilization as well. Okay, so if we get more in detail on the average, how much nitrogen does it take to produce a bushel of corn on average?
Yes, and this is a good question. If we look at the total amount of uptake, we usually about 1.1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen is needed for each bushel of corn that we are producing. However, that's where we start to talk about efficiency. And if we're talking a more efficient system, we basically dilute that nitrogen that's going into the grain. So that number can start to vary a little bit. In our recommendation system, we use yield goal times 1.6. That's a number that we use as a reference, including a little bit some of the efficiency, because again, nitrogen, we don't get 100% efficiency from that nitrogen. We do get some of that nitrogen maybe tied up, or it's not available in the season for different reasons. And we basically start to look at the whole system. What else is there in terms of nitrogen? We need to look at the profile what we have. Nitrogen in the profile, take that into account. In many cases, we can have significant levels of nitrogen, and all of that needs to go in that calculation for fertilizer recommendation for corn. Again, not just think about how many pounds we are removing, how many pounds is needed, but also think a little bit about, okay, where is that nitrogen coming from, and how we can improve that efficiency.
Okay. And so he mentioned the 1.6 pounds that it takes, and so we use that. K-State uses that recommendation or that amount in order to come up with the recommendation based on other factors as well.
Other factors, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So let's move to grain sorghum. Is a starter fertilizer needed, and on average, about how many pounds of nitrogen does it take to produce a bushel of grain sorghum?
Yes, and the amount of nitrogen that's needed for bushel is basically the same as corn for grain sorghum. Those are crops that are very similar in terms of nutrient uptake in general and the needs. So the values are the same. Now you asked about starter fertilizers, and sorghum can also benefit from starter fertilizers. Even though we're planting that a little bit later, conditions are warmer soils and so on, we can still see benefits. And again, kind of go back again to some of the points that we mentioned earlier. We're talking low tested B, or nitrogen application, maybe it's going to be done later, or things like that. Putting some phosphorus and some nitrogen as a starter fertilizer is pretty important for sorghum as well. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind with starter fertilizers, and this applies for sorghum, but also other crops for that matter, is placement of that starter fertilizer. And we always talk about 2x2. That's kind of the default. That's a traditional placement. But it's more and more difficult to have planters, especially bigger planters, that are going to have all the attachments and will be able to do that 2x2 placement. So a lot of people is doing in-furrow applications, so basically putting that fertilizer in the furrow with the seed. We have to keep in mind that there's some risk associated with that. In other words, we cannot put too high of a rate in that kind of application. And that's something that we definitely have to keep in mind. And again, in the case of corn, for example, and sorghum, we usually say don't put more than 10 pounds of nitrogen plus potassium because of the seedling damage that we can see there. So if we want to put a little bit higher rates, one alternative, and we have a lot of data on this, is to dribble that fertilizer on the surface. So we're basically doing a starter fertilizer, we dribble a little bit on the side, an inch or two on the side, and we can put much higher rates. And data shows that it's equally as efficient as a 2x2, especially again as we're putting some of those higher volumes. So again, those are some things that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about starter fertilizers for again milo, but also for corn and other crops.
Okay. Alright. So if you would like copies of some of the research and things that K-State done, just give me a call at any of the Post Rock Extension District offices, and I'll try to fix you up with some of that information. Okay, lastly, soybeans. What about a starter fertilizer on soybeans for this spring?
Soybeans is typically a crop that will not show much benefit from starter fertilizers, and typically is not one that we worry much about from the starter fertilizer standpoint. We just don't see that response like we do in corn and like we do in milo, for example, or winter wheat for that matter. You know, we really like starter fertilizer. Having some fertilizer with the drill can help a lot with tillering and so on. So soybean don't show that same response. However, using some starter fertilizer to complement fertility in soybean can still be one alternative. In other words, you know, if we have some really good yields in the case of the previous crop, and we just want to complement a little bit, it's an excellent way to go ahead and put some fertilizer, and that way we're not, you know, mining the soil so much with that soybean. So definitely one way to do that with the starter fertilizer.
Okay. And lastly, can you give us your thoughts on using some fertilizer enhancement products? You know, you talked about in your presentation, there's products such as Agritain, Avel, Nutrisphere, ESM with either corn, milo, or maybe even soybeans. So can you give us a little bit of information, kind of some of the research that you guys have done?
Yes, we have a lot of research, some of things that I've done in my group, but also a lot of research from other colleagues here in K-State, but also in other neighboring states in some of these products. A lot of the products, well, the products that you mentioned basically focus on nitrogen, and that's one thing to maybe emphasize first, is that we do tend to see a lot more of these products for nitrogen management, and the ones that have a lot of research that shows benefit. Again, tends to provide some significant improvement in some cases, but the key really is, are we seeing, do we have a risk for nitrogen losses in a particular field? To me, that's really the first question. If you don't have the need to apply some of these additives, maybe it's not going to make a difference. So that's the first step. If we decide that it's needed, we have the risk for nitrogen losses, then we can see some benefit from things like Agritain, for example, which is MBPT. Actually, there are many other brands in the market now with MBPT. Definitely can help with volatility of urea. So if we are applying urea late spring, for example, for milo, late spring application, warm temperatures, and potential for urea volatility surface apply broadcast, then things like MBPT can definitely help. And then we have, you mentioned things like ESM, for example, slow release type products. We see a lot more benefit from those usually in weather situations, where we have a lot of water, potential for leaching and that sort of things. So that's where we tend to see a lot more benefit. So kind of go back again to what is the risk of losing that nitrogen first, and then decide what kind of products to look at.
Okay. So we'd like to thank you for joining us here at Facebook. This is kind of the first time that we've done this. Again, my name is Sandra Wick. I'm the crop production agent with the Post Rock Extension District.